Hey guys, this is DFD, aka Dark Frozen Depths, back with another Kamihime project video. Sorry if you hear something in the background, that's my fan. It's gotten hot again because apparently Mother Nature forgot it's winter. But, anyways, this is the second part of the pretty much extensive guide on what each Kamihime does. Now, as before, I'm basically glancing over each Kamihime just to try and shorten how long the videos are, but it will still give you a general idea of what each Kamihime does. And I'm still going through the R Kamihime. If you haven't seen the first video, then there should be a link in the comments that has the entire playlist. So check out the first video to be up to speed to this point. But continuing where we left off, I'm going with Vulcan. And I may butcher some of these names because of how Google Translate works, so you'll be able to tell who's who from the pictures if you just look at that. But anyways, she's Wind. She's an R Kamihime because of course I'm still on the R Kamihime list. But the interesting thing about her is the fact that she has Reflect, and on top of that, she counterattacks when her HP's lower. Like she'll deal extra damage with her ability, her second ability. It'll also recover her own HP. So despite the fact that she cannot attract any sort of attacks towards her, she still is a counterattacker with a long, like the cooldown is long, and so is the duration of a Reflect. But Reflect basically is a damage cut that also returns some of the damage to the, whoever you attacked you. So that's basically her gimmick, and she might help you. It depends on how often she gets targeted. I did hear before that Kamihime in the front, which means the first two slots basically, tend to get attacked much more than Kamihime in the back, but I don't know how true that is. So I just gotta point that out. Now, I have no idea how to even pronounce her name because there's coming up as multiple different translations, but this one is Fire. And her whole thing is just single target focus, but it's honestly not too bad. The attack and defense buff, I think, is around 20 or 30%. I don't know for sure, but again, I'm not going full details. The burst gauge increase, though, however, is very interesting because it's 35. So one ally can really get a burst gauge catch up right there. That said, it may be worth using her in some things like Tower, so that's something to consider. But the whole thing that holds her back is the fact that she's not AoE. And that would honestly be pretty insane if she was AoE, because AoE 35 burst gauge is no small amount. Now I think this one's name is Gongaz or something around that point, but her whole thing, she will do two things. The first skill isn't what you really care too much about, but it is extra damage. It is a damage, like water damage to one enemy, and it's got an okay multiplier of 3 when you get her to level 45, and could possibly be 3.5. But the big thing about her is the fact that she removes one debuff from all allies and then improves the resistance towards debuffs. I don't know that the resistance is AoE or not, but that I can actually check really quickly. Yeah, it is all allies for the resistance. So that's her main gimmick. If you do need some debuff removal, she isn't really a bad option, but the fact that she's R is what holds her back. There are other Kamihime among SR and even SSR that can do the same thing, basically, where they'll remove debuffs and give other effects, basically. Now, Daphne is light, and what she does is pretty much up her own damage output. Now, the thing with that is that while it has a pretty good uptime of basically 3 out of every 5 turns, it's still the fact that it's just to herself. But since it's C-frame, it can be stacked with buffs from other characters. Now, the first skill is Light Attribute and her attack, so it's buffing both her Elemental and Assault. However, when it comes to her second skill, it guarantees she'll combo, but at the cost of making her more likely to get hit. So that's something you gotta be a little bit careful of if you decide to use her. But both skills combined definitely could do quite a bit, so looks are a little bit deceiving. I did use her a little bit on some R missions, and she actually did do some surprisingly good combo damage. Now, Nate is a dark one, and the whole deal with her is the fact that you have to pay attention to enemy modes, because if an enemy is stunned, her first skill will deal 4 times damage. If an enemy is stunned, her second skill does it. Sorry, read that too quick. But she deals 4 times damage with the first skill if an enemy is raging. And if they're stunned, then the second skill will deal 4 times damage. I think it's 1 times multiplier if you do it wrong. So the whole trick about this is that you need to pay attention to what an enemy's state is. Timed right, though, you could use her 4 times rage damage to knock an enemy into stun and then use the other skill to do extra stun damage. So that's something to pay attention to. But however, the only times you would really try to build a team that uses rage and stun based stuff is probably Hector, and by then you'll probably have much better Kamihime. So she's maybe a tower Hime, but that's it. Now Tialok or Titalok, I don't know how to pronounce her name. She's Thunder, and her whole deal is pretty much upping her own attack power, but also giving herself Intercept. Now, Intercept, I believe, is the one where you take no damage and then do a counter hit. Now, I'd have to double check that actually whenever I go through all the buffs and debuffs if I ever make that video. But the whole thing with that is that she is essentially another counter attacker, if that makes sense. Now, if you remember from the previous video, the buff named counterattack is actually Pride. But what I mean by counterattacker is somebody that either takes damage or just ignores it and then sends back her own. So the fact that she's buffing both Assault and Elemental on one skill, and then she's got a 5-turn duration to Intercept, she's basically a more offensive version of Volsdoom, who was the first one I covered in this video. So she's not bad in some tower things, but it depends. Now Vulcan is actually an R Kamihime that I use quite a bit, and that's for these two effects. Her first skill, 8 times random damage. These usually don't have too many multipliers per hit, but it can add up. Like right here it says about a 20,000 soft cap, and it's like a 0.6 magnification, but that's still 160,000 towards one enemy if you do that. However, the second skill she has will increase her attack power and her ability damage, so it's basically Assault and Elaborate without an ability cap increase. So that said, she can actually do a good amount of ability damage if you need somebody to do some quick cleanup on some enemies. So she's not a bad R Kamihime to use. Kamadeva, now she's one I used a lot on light R teams. However, it is very, very RNG in her case. Main thing is the fact that she is like I would say Mordred on roids, but her debuff chances are low. So you really want to increase your debuff rates if you do decide to use her. However, what she does, her first ability will reduce defense, white resistance, and debuff resistance. Her second ability will reduce dark attack, normal attack, and combo attack rates. So that means that an enemy can get debuffed with both white and defense resistance, and on top of that, assault drops as well as darkness elemental. So against dark enemies, she can essentially be a, if I recall, 40% defense and attack down if you're lucky, along with reducing combo rates and debuff resistance. It is still a low chance for any one of these to land, but you usually get at least one or two. So that's something to keep in mind. And Orpheus, she's another one I tend to use a lot because she is a wind Kamihime, and what she gives is illusion and enthusiasm. Now, illusion is basically to put dizzy. I had to double check on that one because sometimes Google translates weird. But illusion is to put dizzy on all enemies. The reason why I use her is enthusiasm, because enthusiasm gives burst gauge to all allies at the end of the turn. And you do take damage off it, but the regen can easily be covered. Like, regen can easily cover that. So if regen works, even flat heals are probably better. But it's the fact that she will give AoE burst gauge fill for 2 turns. So that can really speed up burst cycles, and quite honestly, a lot of Wind Hime are known for building up burst cycles. It's just the fact that Light tends to do it as well with the right Hime, so they're really in competition with each other for who's the fastest. It depends on who you use and who you have access to. Now, Chaos is an R Kamihime. I did use her a little bit, but there is a bit of a catch with her. Now, in her case, her first ability, she will increase her attack power and her stinger, which is basically a chance of a critical hit if you have elemental advantage. So if she's attacking a light enemy, that's where stinger has a chance of kicking in. Now, stinger does have its own multiplier, so that can really spike her damage output. However, the reason why I sometimes use her is this, because she will deal HP damage to an enemy based on their current HP. And that caps at 100,000. So, I do believe it's like 20% of what their current HP is. Also, apparently her buff is C-frame, so it stacks pretty well with other buffs if you have them for your team. But that second turn is just almost always 6-digit damage. Like almost always 6-digit or even 5-digit damage, because a lot of enemies in the game have quite a lot of HP in order to do that. So she can get a quick amount of damage out there, even though she may not even have normal hits that add up to that much. So it depends on the situation, but she may be good for a quick ability nuke. Sequoia, I started using her for our teams for water, mainly because of these two abilities. She is single target healing. However, it is very good healing because of the fact that she will heal an ally and grant a barrier every 3 turns, and then on top of that, every 5 turns she can remove a debuff off an ally while making them immune to the next debuff. So honestly, if you need to like have one Hime catch up on heals, she's good for that, and then she'll also protect them. And the fact that she can do it every 3 turns isn't too bad. Now, the healing is low, but the barrier is still pretty good. Like, the healing is about 500, which is pretty standard for our Hime, but the barrier is 1500, so that's something to consider. Now, Rhea is Thunder, and it sounds like my fan kicked in on this computer, but Rhea is Thunder, and what she basically does is up her own combo attack damage. So what she does is increase her chances of doing double attack and giving herself an energy drain. The reason she has that energy drain is because her second skill is Rampage plus Overheat. Overheat, if I remember correctly, it is basically a damage over time. Enemies that usually use Overheat can get a attack buff. I don't think she gets it, but she's already boosting her damage output with normal attacks anyway when you consider the Rampage. Rampage prevents you from using any other skills though, so if you are going to use her, I would put the double attack first with the energy drain and then the rampaging. That said, you'll also counteract the overheat a little bit too, because energy drain will drain HP every time she lands a hit, so the more she combos, the more health she'll get back. A 10 is another light Hime, and I don't really use her too much, but she can do some stuff, basically. She's got some major drawbacks, though. First off, when she bursts, her attack power gets reduced. So that's already the first drawback, and that is something that a lot of our Kamihime have, is like some drawback to their kit. Now, the second thing is the fact that she can boost her own attack power and her own combo rate, but it reduces her defense. So, even though she can counteract the attack down a little bit, she's lowering her defense. The other thing is that she spikes her damage against stun enemies, and that's for the next time she attacks them. That, on its own, could lead to some very surprising damage from her. However, she is easily risk versus reward, and for that reason, I usually don't use her. So, that's something to keep in mind. Now, Ceres is a dark Hime. I usually don't use her too much either. However, she's got two forms of overheating herself, and that's dealing damage with her first ability, and then she can increase her own attack, defense, and combo rate, but still give herself overheat. So her whole thing is the fact that she will keep reducing her HP because of overheat. She can, however, deal some okay damage with her buff, so that's something to keep in mind. The dark damage isn't too great. I don't know how much the multiplier really is or anything. Actually, it says it's 4x multiplier, but considering the case of overheat, it will really start siphoning away her HP, so if you are going to use her, definitely have a healer to cover her. Now, and that is one that I've used before, mainly because of the fact that she's got two abilities that really spike her own self-damage output. She's got Rampaging, which is almost double normal attack damage for 5 turns. And then she's also got a regen for 5 turns. Now, granted, it does lock her into just normal attacks for 5 turns if you use Rampaging. However, what makes her a little bit different than most cases is the fact that our Kamihime tend to have very, very slow burst speeds. A lot of them really don't combo too well. So in those cases, you probably will be doing quite a bit of normal attacks. Rampaging is still considered to be pretty bad when you have more than 2 turns of it, maybe more than 3 turns. But In the case, her case is probably a bit of a workaround because there's a good chance you're probably not bursting with our Kamihime anyway, since their burst multipliers are lower than anything else in the game aside from N and R weapons. So, that's something to know. Now then, Fire Mephistopheles. If you remember Kamadeva, Fire Mephistopheles is pretty much like her. So that's a good sum of what her second ability does. However, she's got a first ability to go with it. So, second ability, it is basically Kamadeva's entire kit, but focused towards fire. And of course, wind attack powered down because fire has advantage over it. It's basically Kamadeva's entire kit, except for there's no debuff resistance debuff, and there's no combo rate debuff. She will basically just deal defense down, attack down, fire resist down, and wind attack down. But it's a low chance for any of those to land. The first skill, however, deals poison, burn, I think it's putrefy, what they call corruption, drown, blind, and dizzy with a low chance. So in a sense, her second skill is like Kamadeva. Her first skill is like Mordred. But they're both at a low chance of landing anything. So it is definitely RNG, but I do love using her for Fire R teams because she has so many debuffs. There's a very good chance at least one of them is going to land. And the interesting thing too, I forgot to point out with Kamadeva. If you land Fire Resist down, that increases her chances of debuffing. Because Elemental Resistance down also works as an attribute, like a weird attribute version of debuff resistance. So it will stack with that. That said, she can be surprisingly good at times, so maybe worth using her if you feel like taking a gamble. Now this one, Ariel, I don't use her too much, but she can be a little bit helpful if you want to like single out a single character to prevent them from damage. She's Thunder, and what she does is give stealth to one ally, which reduces the chances of them taking damage. However, this turns into Hideout, which I think fully prevents them from even being targeted with single target attacks. Yeah. It starts off as Stealth, which reduces the chances of them being targeted, and then Hideout, when she gets her ability buffed, it prevents that one character from being targeted from anything but AoE. Now, the other one is granting protection to one ally, and I don't remember what that is. Oh, okay. That one is pretty much a cover effect where one ally will step in front of all the attacks. So she's good for manipulating who you want to get hit. That's why I say she can be good. So Hideout is to give somebody you don't want to get hit, and Protection is basically somebody you want to soak up all the damage. Assuming it's not AoE, because AoE will just completely destroy her kit. Now, Thunder Ignis. For starters, I've never gotten her. I don't think. And she's also limited, so you may or may not have her. But what she does is basically increases her chances of doing critical hits with Stinger, while decreasing her defense. And she will also AoE damage with her ability. That Stinger lasts for quite a long time. It is 4 out of every 6 turns, so essentially 2 out of every 3. However, the fact that she decreases her defense and the fact that Stinger only works against enemies that are weak against her element, that's very situational. Me personally, I don't regret missing out on her. Although she does look cute, I will admit that. I can see some uses for her, but not many. So, I don't think it's worth going out of your way for her. Dis, or however you pronounce her name, she's light. And what she'll do is basically focus entirely on herself, but the interesting thing is that her one drawback, she has a little bit of a counter to it. Now, the one drawback, she'll reduce her defense, but at the same time up her combo rate and her burst gauge increase. So, that said, she's going to increase her own burst gauge. It's 20% increase. But she'll also take 50% more damage because of the defense down. And she's also upping her own combo rate while doing that burst gauge increase, so it's got a good chance of abusing the extra burst gauge she'll get per hit. Now, what counteracts that is the fact that her first skill is an AoE ability damage nuke, but the big factor of it is that it will recover her own HP. So she'll heal back some of what she might take, and it's up to 1,000, which is actually pretty good. Like, for a self heal, 1,000 is actually pretty good. Like, 4 digits, you definitely want your heals to be around that point. Because factor in Ascension, she can actually deal up to 3,000 heals, which is very good. But, anyways, she's not too bad on trying to increase her own burst gauge and combo rate, so maybe she's okay in some tower teams, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. Now then, here's more limited Hime I don't think I have. Starting with the dark version of Zerul. Now this, she will help out when it comes to debuffing enemies. Her second skill is dark damage to one enemy and reduces their debuff resistance. Her first skill, however, is AoE damage and AoE defense down on all enemies, and it is C-frame. C-frame, if you remember from my first video, or just in general, is a pretty rare frame to come across. So, that said, it can stack pretty nicely with other defense down, so if you have her on a tower team, she might actually be kind of useful because of the defense down. It's not that big, it's only 10%, but the fact that it's in another frame can easily cover for all that. Now, another Kamihime I do not have is Wind Apesh. And it looks like they didn't even get a proper image for her too, unfortunately. Now, what she does, she gives sleep and dizzy to all enemies. And she gives regen to all allies while removing a debuff. That on its own right sounds pretty good. Definitely for an R Kamihime. I would probably even use her over some SR because of that. Reason being is because if dizzy lands, it can make enemies skip turns. If sleep lands, it forces them to not have a turn, as long as it's in effect, and it increases the damage they take. Then on top of that, you're getting regen on top of the buff removal. I mean, on top of the debuff removal. Regen isn't all that great, but it's still free healing. And it says 300, so it's up to 900 healing over time. So, that said, best case scenario, Dizzy will land and interrupt turns, and you'll just regen everybody to recover their HP. And then if sleep happens to stay throughout that entire thing, then you're also dealing more damage. Because remember, if an enemy gets hit while in sleep status, there's a chance they might wake up. So, she's not bad actually for a limited Hime. Not bad for an R Hime in general. Now then, White Caspio. I love using her wind version for our teams on wind, but I love using her white version even better for white R teams. She has been on every white R team I have had since she's been introduced and I've gotten her. Reason being is because she AoE hits all enemies for a defense down and C frame. Again, that is a rare frame to have. And then on top of that, she has a stackable defense down on one enemy. Another rare debuffing frame. And even though it is small, only like 3%, it can eventually add up over time. I tend to get at least a good 5-6 stacks of it. So on her own, you'll easily get about 20-25% defense down on her own. And it is likely not to get interrupted by anybody else because, again, C-frame is not common. Stackable will stack with other debuffs that stack. So it is very good to actually have her for white R teams. So if you happen to pull her, you definitely did get one of the best white R Hime in my opinion. Okay, so Mokosh. I've started using her for dark R teams because of this one ability right here. She does dark damage to one enemy, but if it lands, it is a 20-second paralysis. And paralysis is very, very powerful in this game because when it lands, the enemy is guaranteed to not do anything. And it cannot be removed until the duration runs out. 20 seconds is actually one of the longer paralysis because usually it's 15 seconds. 20 seconds is actually long. It is enough time to get in if you do nothing else. 3, maybe 4 normal attacks when you reload in order to skip the animations. That's actually pretty good. Paralysis usually has a low chance of landing in order to counteract that, but when it lands, it's very good. She also can deal 4 hits of dark damage to a single enemy with her second skill, and it's not too much, but it can add up. It's up to 200,000, which is very good for an R Kamihime. Ability damage in general, it's not that great, but again, the first skill definitely makes her worth attempting to use. Because again, paralysis is a very, very potent debuff. And it is a common strategy on guild, on like the union events. And then even some guild competitions too, if you can get it off. To just have enemies skip turns because you put paralysis on them. Now then, Nanar. She is a Thunder Kamihime. The thing with her is the fact that she will manipulate what you get, essentially. Her buffs are large, like very, very big buffs. The counterbalance to that is the debuffs that she also puts on allies. For starters, she puts a 40% attack up. If you have the skill upgraded, a 40% attack up on all allies. She also ups the combo rate, but the defense is reduced by 10%. On the flip side, her second ability is a 40% defense buff. Reduces not combo. It's attack reduction, sorry, by 20%. But it also grants a regen for all allies. Each of these is 2 turns. Her second skill strangely has 4-turn cooldown instead of 5, but you get nothing but buffs if you happen to put both on yourself. Because the way attack and defense down work, if you have an attack or defense up, it just removes it from the total. So if you put, say, both buffs on herself, on all allies, I mean, it will give essentially 20% attack up and 30% defense up, because it will counteract each other while still giving the combo rate and the regen. However, if you do have some buff removal or buff protection, you can still use, I mean, debuff removal or debuff protection, you can still use both and get 40% to both for all allies. And 40% is not a small number. Most characters in the game cannot buff to 40%. So, that said, she is pretty powerful when used right, even against SR and even some SSR characters. Even in the case of souls, there's very few souls that can buff more than she can for those buffs. So that said, she can actually be useful even late game, just for the buffs alone. And those buffs do have quite a lot of uptime. It's the debuffs you gotta worry about because of the simple fact that you're generally not going to want to get debuffed, but you can work around it. Now, this Thunder version of Nate, and honestly I think she looks really cute. I don't know if I have her or not. But the thing is with her, she has two very, very interesting effects. If an enemy is debuffed at all, her second skill will deal 4 times damage. Otherwise, I think it's like 1 times. What makes her interesting is the fact that she is an AoE paralysis with thunder damage. It is only 15 seconds, and like I said before, 15 seconds is pretty common with paralysis, but the fact that it's AoE makes it pretty powerful if it lands on every enemy. Now granted, it is a low chance to even land on one enemy, so getting it on every enemy in a fight, yeah, that's kind of tricky. However, it is still very, very good potential, because it is literally just AoE free turns. That said, I wouldn't really use her too much in the late content, but in tower teams, she can definitely be very, very powerful. And again, some guild competitions, but especially union events, paralysis is commonly looked for because you spam it and never let the enemy get a turn. It's like, okay, you use your paralysis, then your union member uses their paralysis, and you just cycle through all that. It is commonly used in union events. However, it's the fact that now union events have some resistance towards that too, so that strategy is kind of still going downhill a little bit, but it's still doable. Now, Kuwabera, a white Kamihime. She's another very interesting one, but she definitely needs some healing to have some protection. If you use her second skill, everybody on the team gets a 40% defense up. And remember what I said about the previous Kamihime. That is a very large buff amount, because very few can match or surpass that amount. At the same time, she will consume 15% of her maximum HP. So she definitely needs a healer to go with that one. The biggest catch, though, is the fact that she will disable all damage an ally takes. And it's for 2 turns if you upgrade it. Usually those are 1 turn. So for 2 turns, that is actually pretty powerful. That said, she can put it on herself and counteract the HP loss. But even then, she's not too bad to be using for our Kamihime teams. Something worth considering. Now then, going for Charis on Wind. She can also be a pretty potent buffer. In fact, I think this is the point where they started releasing Kamihime that can actually match a rarity higher than them, at least for R and SR. But her whole deal is to AoE buff evasion and combo rate on the first skill. The second skill AoE buffs wind element. So she's going to buff your combo rate. She's going to reduce the chances you get hit. Because evasion, when it triggers, means you will not take damage from that normal attack. It can also be paired with blind. So it can really, really mess with an enemy's normal attack rates when you use both blind with her evasion. And then on top of that, she's also increasing your wind elemental damage, which is pretty much upping your output. Buffers commonly get used because of that, and AoE buffers tend to stand out a lot. Quite frankly, she is very good for an R Kamihime team for wind. Very, very good for that. So definitely consider using her if you're going for R Kamihime. Speaking of R Kamihime, there is Wind Kamadeva, and essentially she is the same thing as her she's basically the same thing as her light version, but towards wind element. I don't have to explain any more than that, really. Like, only things I can really say about that is that she will do wind resist, but lightning elemental attack for the corresponding skills. So, if you've paid attention to what I said for a light version, same thing for the wind. Essentially, if you have wind attacking a thunder enemy, then you're basically going to have the same result. It's a low chance of all that landing, but it's up to 40% attack and defense reduction. Keep in mind too, that wind version of Kamadeva is limited. Another one that's limited is Dark Kushinada, and she's an interesting one if you happen to pull her. Because of these two effects, actually. One enemy will get an attack and defense debuff, and when those are paired together, it is usually B frame. Now, in her case, it is indeed B frame. It is only 15%, but it can become 20% when it gets upgraded. Now, what makes her interesting is definitely her burst and her second ability. Her second ability, she will step in front of all attacks, just like her water version does. Now, what makes this interesting is the fact that she gives herself Indomitable, meaning she will not die the one turn she does that. However, if she's at 1 HP, it won't work. That's the thing with Indomitable. I had to double check that one because there's two different versions of that, and I know one of them is like literally you cannot die, and the other one is you just get left at 1 HP. Now, hers, you get left at 1 HP if she takes a fatal blow. So the one turn she probably won't die. I think multi-hit might be able to bypass it, but that's literally the only case. Now, in the case of her burst, whenever she bursts, she reduces the orb count by 1. So, she's one of the few Kamihime in the game that has some sort of mechanic like that. That said, if you can get her burst cycles up there, she can be quite a good orb removal. So, that said, she's actually not bad for our Kamihime teams for Dark. Especially since she's debuffing an enemy. Now, 10 turns is very, very long for her stuff. That is a very long cooldown. But it's still the fact that she can do it that makes it worthwhile. Now then, somebody that isn't limited is Wind version of Matt. I think she gets another one later down the line. But here's what makes her very, 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 very interesting. Second ability, she will eat up 20 of her own burst gauge, so you may want to put her in the very last slot, but increase the combo rate, not the combo, increase the stinger effect of all allies. So she is an AoE stinger. And I think it's actually pretty noteworthy too. I think. Yeah, they don't have the actual amount. It's probably on a huge buff and debuff list. But AoE Stinger buff, pretty good if you're using her against Thunder enemies. What really makes her noteworthy, and this is something else that a lot of Kamihime cannot match, she removes 2 debuffs off an enemy for her first ability. If you get her to level 45, which makes it stronger, 3 debuffs off of a single enemy. I mean 3 buffs off an enemy. So she is one of the characters in the game that removes the most buffs in one shot. That can make her pretty worthwhile for some content, and especially in tower where you're going up against an enemy that buffs themselves a lot. So that said, she is definitely worth using in some situations. I would stick her on a few Origami Hime teams for win, especially because of the Stinger buff. Again, if you're going advantage element, which you really should in a lot of cases, especially with Origami Hime teams, that Stinger buff will definitely help. But the fact that she's removing 3 buffs off an enemy, not many characters in the game can do that. Not many characters in the game can remove 2, so let alone that, that's very good. Now, I don't remember how to pronounce her name, DK, I think it is. Some people might still say Dyke, but she had another version which is Thunder, and it's limited. I did manage to pull it, though. Now, what has a drawback for her, her first ability isn't bad. It's just a defense down with some lightning damage, some thunder damage that she does. However, the second one is what the drawback is. She will put water attack down, I do believe. And the lightning damage on is actually pretty high too. I had to double check that. 440,000 soft cap. That is nothing to sneeze at, because a lot of SR and R Kamihime cannot even get that far with ability damage. The drawback is the fact that the enemy that gets hit with it instantly gets their orbs full. That is a huge drawback. It can, however, manipulate when you get hit with an overdrive. So when you want an enemy to burst, like say you have an AoE damage cut that's at the ready, and you want an enemy to get bursted, you get a burst off on you because you're well protected against it, maybe that can help. But the fact that she is going to put an enemy to max with that and still do a lot of damage it's counterproductive. So to be quite honest, I wouldn't use her too much. But she can debuff attack and defense down, basically. It's water attack down, so it only works against advantage element, but... And she does do a lot of damage with that ability, Nuke, not gonna lie, but... The charge turn max is the counteracting thing to that. Now, Weber... I don't know why it's called Rebel for that. Again, Google Translate. Weeble, I have to look at what she does, because there is a few things that go on with her. First and foremost, she will put Stackable Attack up on herself. And that is up to 5 stacks just looking at this. But if you do have some ability cooldown removal, she can put even more. Or even stack it with other people's. She will also recover 2... just heard something in the background. But, she will also recover 2 debuffs off herself and increase her own burst gauge. Now, the random effects she can put on herself are all bad, except for maybe the rampaging. And the enthusiasm if it happens. So there's a bit of a gamble with her. Rampaging, if it happens, 1 turn. If sweep is put on her, 2 turns. Drowning, it is 3 turns and takes out 5% of her HP every turn. Dizzy is 3 turns. Defense down is 3 turns and it can stack. Now, Enthusiasm is the one you want because that will be a 5% HP reduction, but give herself 10 burst gauge. And that's for 2 turns. And she can heal her HP. And it's up to 1500 without any ascension. That said, there is so many different effects that can happen, and it is a gamble on what happens. Essentially, she has roughly about, I would say, a 50% chance of getting something good. But I don't know the exact rates of it. But half of what can happen is probably good. Because Rampaging again can up her damage. It can really up her damage. It just sticks her to normal attacks. Now, the thing is, if it's not Rampaging or Sleep, she can remove some of the bad stuff with her second ability, which also increases her burst gauge by 20. So that's something to know. Now, the bad thing is the fact that her burst also has random side effects, which again is a heal. There's also Uplifting, which is an attack buff, and it is for 2 turns, or until a certain number of attacks are done. That will stack with attack up. She can also have Intercept, which I do believe will prevent herself from taking damage, but also counterattack with her own damage. Up her own evasion. Sleep is also there again, but this time it's 2 turns. A 1-turn paralysis. So, the thing with all this is the fact that both her burst and her normal attacks can do random stuff, and it is a gamble on whether or not she will get something good. That said, though, combined with her first ability and her burst, if you're lucky, she can suddenly recover so much HP, it's ridiculous. Because, that said, while you're trying to stack attack buffs, if it all keeps coming up as HP recovery and then she bursts right after that, she suddenly healed 7,500 HP to herself. And that's without Ascension. With Ascension, it can triple. So, yeah, if you're lucky, she can start recovering a lot of HP, so it's a gamble. It is definitely a gamble. However, I think you'll probably win more than lose with her, so she might be worth using as a Thunder or Kamihime, but it's all just to herself, so keep that in mind. Now then, I'm hitting close to an hour, so I'm going to go over one last Kamihime. And that's Sukadela, or however, it's hard to pronounce her name. They call her the Glasses Cowgirl, you see why. Although to be quite honest, she does look kinda hot. She is water-based. Now, here's what's going to make her pretty interesting. She will increase the amount of Mo gauge reduction all allies do, and increase their double attack probability for 3 turns with her first ability. And her second ability, she will deal water damage and put Dizzy on an enemy. There is an increased chance of landing it too if an enemy is raging. So she is a very good raging counter for our Kamihime, to be quite honest. Now, that said, the Mo gauge reduction isn't direct, but it can help. But as far as it goes with her kit, she's a very good raging counter. So, in some tower content where you have to really pay attention to raging modes, she can actually be surprisingly good. Especially since she's AoE dealing it, boosting everybody. So, that said, she's kind of niche. but pretty good for some content if you happen to use a R Kamihime for that or R team. So that's something to know. But anyways, that's it for this video. I will continue this again with Yakimihime. And again, this is a long list. I will probably still take another 2, maybe 3 videos to go through all of the current Kamihime on this list. And I know pretty soon they're going to be releasing more Kamihime. So by the time I finish off this R Kamihime list, if they added more by then, I'm not going to really go over them until everybody is done. At least to that current point. So I will keep track of where that is, and hopefully I will finish this off before they add more Kamihime. But, boy. And you'll notice later down the line too, there's going to be a massive surge of limited Kamihime. So keep that in mind. But anyways, that's all for this. Again, I'm going to continue with Yakimihime. It is hard to pronounce her name. But this video is going on long enough, so again, this is part 2. There's going to be more parts later on, and this is still just the R Kamihime. I haven't even gotten to the other rarities yet, at all. But that's all for now, guys. More of this will come soon, and take care.